So Peter Huessy, our first speaker, is senior fellow of the National Institute for the Deterrence Studies, think tanks who provides deterrence education, national security analysis, and policy solutions. And he also president of GeoStrategic analysis. He also did before a lot of work for Hudson Institute and for other think tanks. So also here in the panel we have John Herbst, who will stay with us, former American diplomat who was United States Ambassador to Uzbekistan and United States Ambassador to Ukraine, Senior Director of Atlantic Council Eurasia Center, Adam Schindler, Chief Digital Officer of America First Institute, First Policy Institute think tank. He also very involved to Jerusalem Prayer Breakfast, and he was co-organizer of that in Jerusalem, Dallas, and San Antonio, Texas. So let's start our first panel discussion and a general overview of situation. And I will explain also how I involved to Ukraine. So generally, my father was elected from southern Ukraine several times, and after when war starts, he was in Russian sanction list, he was in Russian killing list. They took our property because it's technically their nationalization. So, and my work is generally political communication work. So that's why we start deep analysis work from Institute to Democracy and Development to really make impact and, to work here in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels to push some solutions, some direct constructive solutions. So this first panel will be about solutions. And I will ask firstly Peter to do general overview of situation in Middle East and Ukraine also. And also I will ask everybody to find some similarities and some differences in this conflict. And also it will be first row of our discussion. And second row, it will be your generally proposals and solutions for Middle East and for Ukraine. Of course, it's not possible to do in 3 minutes, but we ask be in time and not more than 5 minutes in first answer and 3 minutes in second answer to jump to second panel about humanitarian. So Peter, please, your overview about situation.
Thank you very much, Katerina. I'm Peter Huessy. I'm senior fellow at the National Institute for Deterrence Studies. And I want to talk to you about something that I've titled The Role of Religious Faith and Moral Clarity in Taking Down the Soviet Union and Winning the Cold War. The reason I say that is if you go to the Victims of Communism Memorial here in Washington, D.C., go on their website. They did a conference just a couple years ago on exactly this subject. And you have to understand, Tony Dolan was the chief speechwriter for Reagan, and he gives a fabulous hour-long discussion of religious faith and moral clarity and what role that played in the takedown of the Soviet Union. I want to go back when I was an intern here in Washington, D.C. in the White House, and then before that I was in the Senate as an intern in the early 1970s during détente and peaceful coexistence. Number one, we had, under the rubric of containment, talked about dealing with the Soviet Union. Well, the first test of that was Korea. And do you know who opposed sending American soldiers to Korea? George Kennan, supposedly the author of Containment. In the 1970s, if you just do the numbers, starting with Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, and ending with Afghanistan, 18 countries flipped from pro-American to pro-Soviet. 18 during the period of détente and peaceful coexistence. Détente and peaceful coexistence basically fudged the issue of can a democratic constitutional republic of America, leading the free world, get along with a totalitarian tyranny, the Soviet Union? I remember in this very room, Max Kampelman, who was Hubert Humphrey's lawyer and was a negotiator on behalf of the United States under Ronald Reagan for SDI. He gave a speech here about exactly this issue. He said, can you deal with a country that takes people they disagree with politically and puts them in psychiatric hospitals? Is that not the definition of evil? And the reason he said that is that was a month after Ronald Reagan's speech before the evangelicals, where he described the Soviet Union as an evil empire. Now, that same month, he did two other things. Is the MX missile was approved by the Scowcroft Commission, for which you can find me guilty, because that's how I started my seminar series here at the club, and I've been doing it for 40 some odd years. And the other thing he did was he announced SDI. Well, if you're sitting in the Kremlin and you see all those three things, and he did a fourth thing. He sat down with the Pope John, and agreed to send $8 million a year to Solidarity. Now, Solidarity, as you know, was the British labor union, the Polish labor union. And there's a interesting thing here is in 1683, on September 11th, was the high water mark of the Muslim conquest of Europe. And that's where it stopped, which is why they attacked us on September 11th. So what was Reagan's alternative? It was moral clarity based on telling the world who the Soviets were and what their empire was about, whether it was Nicaragua or Cuba, or whether Vietnam or North Korea or Syria. Remember, the Soviet Union was the largest state sponsor of terror in the world. Now, Iran now has that, but Iran just is doing the dirty work for China, and as the ambassador pointed out. So what did Reagan say? We're not going to do containment. We're not going to do détente and peaceful coexistence. We're going to roll back. Now, for those of you who want to know how we did this, Reagan himself said, we made economic war on the Soviet Union. There is a publication, it's called the National Intelligencer. It's by Myron Norquist. His son is Grover Norquist, who you know from American Tax Reform. This paper was written in 2001. It's How the United States Won the Cold War by Warren Norquist. It's the most detailed explanation, and I'll give it to you in a summary. Russia's foreign exchange in 1980 was $30 billion. That is what they used to run their empire. By 1989, we had either taken away from Russia or made them have to pay $89 billion to run their empire. They couldn't do it. Gorbachev tried, he arrested 850,000 black market people in the Soviet in Russia, because that was anathema to the communists, because it wasn't a planned economy, it was underground. And not only that, he took 280,000 party members and had them arrested because they were not following the way they were actually part of the underground economy. So we completely misinterpreted what Russia was about. We thought détente and peaceful coexistence. And for example, all of Eastern Europe was getting bank loans from Western banks. And when they couldn't pay the bank loans or the interest, guess what? The banks would redo the loans, include all the interest, and stick our banks with the bill if the Eastern Europeans didn't. One of the first things Roger Robinson did on the National Security Council under Reagan is he said, you went to the banks and said, no more loans to Eastern Europe. We all of a sudden cost Russia $6 billion a year in interest. And then he decontrolled oil prices. And what happened then? The price of oil got the Saudis to increase oil production by 10 million barrels a day. Oil went from around $32 a barrel down to $12. And it not only boomed our economy, but took billions of dollars out of the Soviet exchequer. So when you look at security policy in Ukraine, or you look at security policy in Israel, and it's interesting, I'm connected to all these things, kind of interesting. My grandfather, sometime back in the 18th century, his relatives came to Poland from Israel. And in 1969 and 70, I studied in South Korea at Yonsei University. So they're like brothers and sisters to me. I was in what's called the International Division. There were three of us, two girls and myself. We were all from three different schools. And the other thing is I taught at the National Defense University in Ukraine and in Vilnius at the invitation of their embassy people here that used to attend my seminars. So I'm kind of connected to all of these things. And if moral clarity with respect to Korea is very simple, what did President Trump say to the National Assembly in Seoul in his first administration? That's all you need to know about who we're dealing with. There is no détente and peaceful coexistence with North Korea. Okay, with respect to Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran, this fairy tale, and I have to tell you, Bill Clinton said it when he said, if we just give the Palestinian state, all this terrorism goes away. But as the ambassador told us, Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, Iran, they don't care about the Palestinians. They use them, and they've been using them ever since Arafat and company were created by the USSR. But what they do is they use them as a lever to get a lot of money, but then they use that money to commit terrorism against Israel and the United States. Remember, they attacked, 32 separate entities in the Middle East that were U.S. interests shortly, about 2 years ago. So I know we're short of time, but what I want to make a point is, if you're going to do security policy on Ukraine, there is no doubt who the aggressor was, and that's Russia. There is no doubt who the thug is, Mr. Putin. The thing is, does Ukraine have the ability to kick Russia out of the whole country? Tragically, I don't think so. On the other hand, I don't think Russia has the ability to take over the country. So do we do a Finland post-World War II deal where it's ugly as bad and I don't like it, but we may have to settle for less than what we would like to settle for? On the other hand, Israel and the United States have taken down Hamas and Hezbollah very brilliantly. We can take Iran's money and their oil away from them, which we should, and put them on the ropes, where they were over 4 years ago with Donald Trump's first term. I think if you're going to be successful in my business, which is security policy, you have to have moral clarity as to what you're dealing with. Otherwise, you'll fool yourself. And at the end of the Cold War, we said it was the end of history. Everybody's going to accept liberalism. And what happened? We didn't realize that unless we cultivated the democratic elements in Russia, we would end up with, when Yeltsin appointed Mr. Putin as the chief of staff, that was your signal. In 1999, Yeltsin passed a decree saying, I want 10,000 battlefield, highly accurate, small nuclear weapons with which to fight the West. That was April 30th, 1999. You can't find that in the media, even though it was done publicly. There was no mention of it because we were rapturous about, and we kind of forgot about where terrorism was coming from. Remember, Condi Rice said, yeah, I guess they were at war with us, but we weren't at war with them. So I plead with you, religious faith has an enormous, enormous role to play in American security policy. When we get it right, that's the quintessential thing about America. And you can't overemphasize that. And in my view, I thought what Congressman Green said was fabulous. And Kat, thank you again for these conferences that you do. And we're going to hope to see that we can get Ukraine on the right side and get Israel on the right side and end these horrible conflicts. But again, unless we're morally clear about what we're fighting, it's going to be very difficult.
It's a really interesting point of view because usually we talk about conflicts in religious freedom issues, right? It's a lot of publications, but you give to us a really fresh point of view. So let's move also to other position and as you know, American First Policy Institute, more conservative think tank. So if you can explain also your vision on situation in Middle East and Ukraine, similarities and differences, and also maybe prepare us to some solutions.
Yes, thank you. I want to piggyback on what you said. I think it's a really important point to understand the role of religious faith and moral clarity and understanding the moment that we're in. And I think that religious faith and moral clarity comes from understanding the fundamental story that religious claims are making.
Yeah.
And understanding that fundamental story. This is one of the reasons, in hindsight, that the Gulf War experiment and what we've done for the last 25 years didn't work necessarily. I don't think it worked because we didn't understand the role that faith really played in the story there. We thought we could just bring democracy into Iraq, and that's not something that works. And President Trump was in Riyadh this last week, and he was speaking to our Saudi friends and partners, and he was excoriating the globalist endeavor. And he said, this endeavor has failed. And he celebrated Saudi Arabia for all of the faults that they have, just like the United States, but he celebrated them because they built something not on the model of the US, but on the expression of the Saudi culture and the people with their faith, with their moral clarity as they understood. And he was seeking to join forces and relationships, not with an American view of how foreign policy ought to happen, but with an American connection to the way the world understands itself. And so that's part of what the America First Policy Institute and the America First Policy ideals are all about. It's not about being, America First is not America alone when it comes to security policy. It's not isolationism. Certainly there are elements on all sides that want to be isolationist, but the fundamental idea is a first principle that you have to get right the fundamental story, is that people are made in the image of God, that we have an inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that in an individual person rests a sovereignty that can't be infringed upon by an elite governmental academic power structure. When you have that fundamental story, you understand the proper framing, that will influence all of the decisions you make in foreign policy, the stuff that Chairman Green and what he does on the Homeland Security Committee, we protect ourselves because we believe fundamentally that we have a right to life, that every individual is unique. You look at totalitarian regimes, they don't share that same worldview. It's a fundamental shift in the understanding of story. And so one of my roles at the America First Policy Institute, I oversee all of our digital media, putting things out on social media. In Washington, politics deal with the very specific small audience. In digital media, we're talking about a large audience. And I'm constantly trying to remind my leaders and tell stories on the internet that connect to the American public and connect to the hearts of the global community that see the world inside of story. And so when we understand that fundamental story, we're able to rightly align ourselves, and that's where I believe moral clarity comes from. And as a person of faith, ordained pastor, worked in the film industry and written a novel, and I get the faith political convergent story. But fundamentally, it all boils down to we're made in the image of God, and anything that we do in policy that strips that, weakens that, lessens that, is leading us down a path that I think will ultimately lead to societal collapse.
Thank you. Very deep idea. Ambassador Herbst, I also want to ask you about this narrow audience, right? Because now, even Washington, D.C. very polarized. I feel it, for example, in my experience, also even kids talk about elections. So even my daughter in second grade, she talked about elections and about concepts of ideology. So how to build peacekeeping and peace-building concept in so polarized world, and maybe to ignore some media waves is 2 billion budget, because you pretty well in this in this work. So explain please to us also how to survive in this wave of polarization and how to build concepts for Israel and Ukraine.
All right, I think I understand the question, but I apologize in advance if I did not completely understand it. It seems you're raising two things that were somewhat distinct. On the one hand, you were talking about polarization, so I think you were talking about polarization in the United States?
Yes.
Okay. And then you were also talking about trying to achieve a legitimate peace, a durable peace in both the Middle East and in Eastern Europe. Regarding the first question, you should understand I come at this as someone who's conservative by nature, who understands the point made by many speakers here about the importance of religion in a stable, just society. And sadly, I think that the United States is more polarized today than at any time in my intellectually active life, say going back to when I was in high school in the late 60s. And I think that the two parties are being driven by their wings. And in the relationship between those two parties, and I lean more again toward the right, we see the prevalence of, to use an inadequate English word, resentment against the other party, which drives politics in the wrong direction. So the extremes on the one side point to the extremes on the other side to justify their own, let's say, not particularly reasonable policies. And I'll leave that comment there and go to the other question. We face, as I said in my early remarks, an extraordinary challenge today that did not exist at the end of the Cold War, and arguably a challenge greater than the challenge posed by a totalitarian Soviet Union on the march during the Cold War. We, the United States, have the power, a power which is not just the United States alone, but the power of our allies and partners to deal with this challenge. Because of the failure of American policy in 20 years during the global war on terrorism, American activism has been partly discredited because the policy was a failure, and the architects of that policy in both Republican and Democratic administrations never paid a career price for their failures. And I felt that when I was working on failed states in my last job at the State Department, and when I was working at NDU after that in the early, from 2010 to 2014. But there is a tendency in life, including in the United States, for people to learn the wrong lessons from the last war. Mm-hmm. So we were arrogant and fundamentally stupid in the way we tried to remake Iraq, and for that matter, Afghanistan, although we had to go into Afghanistan after 9/11. But as a result of that, and as a result of the failure for there to be a reckoning, which we desperately needed, some people, more on the right than on the left, but on the left too, analogizing from our failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, that even providing support to a country, economic and military support, but not soldiers, is somehow the same failed policy that we pursued in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they are dead wrong. Because as I pointed out in my remarks earlier, those four countries, but most dangerous for the United States, China and Russia, are coming after us. They want to have Ukraine for breakfast, but they want to have us for lunch. And the smart way, the least expensive in treasure and lives to stop this danger, is to arm Ukraine to stop Russia. If Biden had not been intimidated by Putin's nuclear threats, we could have done that easily 2 years ago. We didn't. I thought that the speakers before me were brilliant, but I disagree that we have the inability now to help Ukraine kick the Russians out of at least a substantial portion of Ukraine. Because I'm a realist, that is not my policy objective, because Donald Trump won the election and his view is different from mine. If he pursues his stated policy in a way that meets American interests, to make sure that the aggressor in that war, the party that is unwilling to accept Trump's terms for peace, pays a price by putting substantial pressure on the Kremlin. If Trump does that, he can achieve his objective of having a durable peace. But right now, we see some waffling. And amazingly, the administration is pursuing Obama's ridiculous policy of a reset with Russia, which is exactly the opposite of the economic war that Ronald Reagan waged against the Soviet Union. And there are even people in the administration talking about returning Russian gas to European markets, which not only would restore European dependence on a hostile power, but would remove American natural gas from the European market. So it's a hit against American security and American prosperity. Talk about dumb. Having said that, I think President Trump will ultimately do the right thing, especially if he wants a Nobel Peace Prize. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting. Always a pleasure to listen your points because of so big experience. So my second question to Peter and to all panelists, and it will be the last question in this panel. It's question generally, what can be generally main algorithm and most effective strategy of winning the wars against authoritarian regime? Is it economical cooperation with Ukraine and with Israel? And it can be the same because of concept that Americans will keep their money, right? And with Israel, it generally like work. So even a lot of Israeli companies like here, trading on stock markets, like cooperation is great. Or it's more, something deep that we will support the state because it's right? Because in Lech Lecha chapter of Torah that it's part of like Israel, part of like land for Jewish people, and Ukraine it's independent country and Russia is aggression. So it's like more like deep value issue or economical issue or something else, like I don't know, like alliances and some geo-economical issues. What we must work more.
My view is whatever you can do to kick Russia out of Ukraine, do it. And do it as quickly as possible. Because all you're otherwise, as Victor Hansen points out, is you're turning Ukraine into Verdun, 1917. It's just a meat grinder, and we're just killing. Because and the question is, how much more can we, Ukraine, grab from the Russians, and how much can the Russians grab from Ukraine? And how long are you going to decide, okay, when do we... Now, can we put enough pressure on Putin cutting off his gas? I mean, they made a deal with and they said, well, you can't sell your gas for more than $60 a barrel. Well, whoopee. You just gave all of Europe and China a discount and continued to finance Russia. And guess who's making up the difference? The Chinese. And they're getting a discount on gas to begin with. So they're getting all the benefits from the alliance with Russia, and they're not really paying. So my question is, I don't care whether the deal with Ukraine is economic. I don't care if it's political. I don't care if it's diplomatic. They're allies and friends of ours. They're no threat to Russia, and everybody should know that, for God's sakes. But Russia takes over Ukraine, there'd be an enormous threat to everybody in the region, not just the Baltics, but Poland and Romania and all the rest of it. And we can't have that happen. Now, Putin's a thug. And I don't know. I mean, I read Carlo Kopp stuff and my friend Steve Blank, and I get a sense that Russia has some very serious economic problems. But they're like the Chinese. They lie. And you don't know a lot of the data that you'd like to see. So what do you rely on? Expatriates that go to Russia or they don't, and then they tell us, well, it's really this bad. I understand where the president's coming from. I think he's saying, in the absence of being able to kick Russia out completely, how much do we wait until Ukraine gets the leverage, as he said, cards? Because that's basically what we're talking about. Who has the lever to gain something from a deal? And when does Putin realize that he can be hurt very seriously financially? I understand people worry about, well, what is he going to tell his people about why he did all this? And my view is, who cares? He'll lie about something, which is what he does. And my view is the ambassador is 100% right. We got intimidated by Russia's nuclear threats, and so we took our deterrent off the table. In 2014, President Obama said, it's not our concern. Okay? At least Mr. Trump gave them javelins, which enabled them to go after tanks. And then in 2022, in December 21, the president said, well, we'll respond, but it depends upon how much of Ukraine he grabs. And then a couple days later, they said, oops, we really didn't mean that. Well, the horse is out of the barn, and Putin heard it. And the question is, does he then say, that's really what you think? And you shouldn't have said it, but... So if you go back to 94 and not preparing Ukraine, and then 2014, not responding, and then 22 kind of mixed signals, and then you take your deterrent off the table and say, Mr. Putin, you're not going to use nuclear weapons because then you die. That's the last thing you're ever going to do. Okay? So we're going to arm Ukraine to the extent we need to arm Ukraine and kick your ass out of Ukraine. Excuse my French. But we didn't. We said, oh, we're worried about escalation. Bingo. That's exactly what Putin wanted. And he just brandished, how many times has he brandished nuclear weapons? Dozens and dozens of times. I mean, I'm in the nuclear business. This is what I do for a living. Okay? I don't think I should just say it's bluff, because I think he's reckless enough to use them. On the other hand, we have a deterrent. And we ought to put it on the table. I mean, that whole point is if Ukraine was a member of NATO, we'd have to put our nuclear deterrent on the table. That's the whole point of making somebody part of NATO. But if they're not part of NATO, well, our nuclear deterrent is like, well, it's a little iffy. That's not the right signal to send to Mr. Putin. And my view is it's a tragedy that we will not be able to get, at least I don't think we'll be able to get for Ukraine what they deserve and what they want. But the question is 85% of your country better than 50%? Yeah. Is 100% better than 85? Yeah. The question is, can you get it? And I talked to a lot of my military friends and I said, do you have a military plan that you can tell me on the table that you can go to Congress and say, you give us X billions of dollars in the next 2 years, we can win this? I haven't seen it. And I think it's, the Russians have put landmines and obstructions everywhere where you're going to have to clean that country a yard at a time to go back and get places of the Donbass and Crimea and so forth. So sorry, Kat, but to me, this is the most important national security issue of our time, along with Iran.
Thank you. So we discovered nuclear issue. Adam, what do you think of perspective, maybe more on Israel? So what is more important issue, like economical, pace, maybe something else?
About Israel, well, I would just make a comment. I'm not smart enough to know what to do in the Ukraine, but I do think that NATO is going to play an important role in that.
I agree.
And that we need to see what a long term. I mean, you can negotiate a ceasefire and have momentary peace, but what is the long term solution? And I think the NATO role. One of our guys, chairman of our Center for Law and Justice, Matt Whitaker, has been appointed as U.S. ambassador to NATO, and I'll be very interested in seeing what the Trump administration pursues there. As it relates to Israel, I think that there's complex issues all across the board, but my focus is quite a bit, like I said earlier, on storytelling. I think one of the things in Israel that would be really good for the security and the relationship between the U.S. and Israel, and even inside of Israel, is for that younger generation to understand where they came from. And the stories of Israel, not just as a modern nation state, but as something that God had in his heart for thousands of years. And that next generation of people, that upcoming generation, the young people in Tel Aviv, those that are going to be leading the nation, I think they need to really understand, as they fight for their nation, they need to understand the roots of their nation. Not just that they were birthed in 1948 through the Balfour Declaration and all of the histories. Like, meaning is not carried through propositional truth. It's nested inside of stories. And if that next generation of Israelis understand that, they will be able to rightly confront the threats and to build and forge the lasting bonds of peace between opposing worldviews, because they understand that story.
Thank you. And Ambassador Herbst, please conclude also what issues you think the most important for stable peace building.
Again, the challenge we face is that there are four powers and some smaller powers beyond them who are fundamentally hostile to the United States, its allies, and its friends. That's the beginning of wisdom. In Ukraine, it's very clear. While I think that I would prefer us to have a more ambitious goal in Ukraine than President Trump, his stated objective is a reasonable one. And if he pursues it properly, he can achieve a durable peace. And what that would mean is, A, following up on his initiative, the week the mineral deal was signed, more American weapons would flow to Ukraine to make sure that Putin understands he's not going to be able to grab one more centimeter of Ukrainian territory. And two, the promised economic sanctions. And by the way, I think the most influential man in the Trump administration pushing the right policy to stop Russia is Bessent.
Yes.
Because he is not facing challenges from the quasi-isolationist wing of the party that others like General Kellogg and Secretary of State Rubio face. You do those two things, Putin's got a much larger problem than he has today. And that might persuade him, I'm not saying definitely will, but might persuade him to agree to durable peace terms, which right now he's not willing to do. And right now, they're having a phone call. And I am confident Putin's telling Trump that, I love what you're doing, Mr. President. Just tell those Ukrainians to offer us some more stuff and we can have a peace. And it should at least enable Putin to take control of Ukraine because that's his objective. On the Middle East, I am gobsmacked, as I think I suggested in my early remarks, by the sudden waffling of American support for Israel. Now is not the time to waffle because the Iranians, although much reduced in power because of those brilliant Israeli moves, especially the covert stuff, which took out which basically neutered Hezbollah. Now is not the time to weaken support for Israel. The only serious actions against the four have been Israeli actions against Iran. Let's help them make that permanent. Thank you.
Thank you. It's amen. Let's make it permanent. And thank you so much for this panel. And